Here's something that'll blow your mind. Millennials are now in their 30s and 40s, running companies and raising kids, yet everyone still talks about them like they're confused teenagers who can't figure out how to buy a house. But what if I told you that the real story of millennial psychology isn't about avocado toast or participation trophies? It's about being the first generation to experience a completely unique psychological experiment that's never happened before in human history. Let's start with the basics. Millennials, born roughly between 1981 and 1996, are also called Generation Y, or the Echo Boomers, because of that massive birth surge in the 80s and 90s. But here's what makes their psychology so fascinating. They're caught between two completely different worlds, and their brains had to adapt in ways no generation ever has before. Think about this. Millennials are the bridge generation. They remember life before the internet, before smartphones, before social media. They had childhoods that look a lot like Gen X, with some freedom to roam and figure things out. But then, right as they hit their teenage years and early adulthood, boom, the digital revolution exploded. They became the pioneers of social media, instant messaging, and smartphone culture. They literally watched the world transform around them. This created something psychologists call cognitive flexibility on steroids. Millennials had to constantly adapt and relearn how to navigate the world. Whereas Generation Z was born into the tech-immersed society and just absorb it naturally, millennials had to consciously learn and integrate these new ways of being. It's like learning to be bilingual, but instead of languages, it's entire modes of existence. But here's where it gets really interesting. This constant adaptation came with a psychological cost. Millennials developed what researchers call an external locus of control. Unlike their predecessors who thought they could control their destiny through hard work and following the rules, millennials learned that the rules keep changing faster than you can master them. Let's talk about their relationship with optimism. Baby boomers grew up believing America was heading in the right direction and they could achieve anything through determination. But millennials? They've been hit with crisis after crisis just as they were trying to build their lives. The dot-com crash, September 11th, the 2008 financial crisis, student loan debt that previous generations never faced, and a job market that demands experience for entry-level positions. This created what psychologists call defensive pessimism mixed with stubborn hope. 50% of Generation Z says America is heading in the right direction, but only 42% of millennials feel the same way. Yet millennials keep trying, keep adapting, keep pushing forward. They're not giving up. They're just not naive about how hard it's going to be. Now let's dive into their communication psychology, because this is where things get really wild. Millennials perfected the art of a long-form text message. They developed two-thumb typing skills and will send you paragraph-length texts that read like emails you avoid opening. They were the generation that made Facebook what it was, that created the whole concept of curating your online identity. But here's the twist. While they pioneered digital communication, they still value face-to-face interaction more than you'd think. They're not as digitally native as Generation Z. They remember what it was like to have conversations without screens, so they understand the value of both. Millennials also developed a unique relationship with work that's completely misunderstood. People call them entitled, but that's missing the point entirely. They watched their parents give everything to companies that then laid them off without hesitation. They saw the old social contract, work hard and the company will take care of you, completely fall apart. So millennials created a new psychology around work. They don't believe in company loyalty because companies prove they're not loyal to workers. Instead, they're loyal to their own growth, their own values, their own sense of purpose. They job hop not because they're flighty, but because they learned that the only security comes from continuously building your skills and network. This is also why they prioritize work-life balance and mental health in ways that baffle older generations. It's not that they're weak or can't handle stress. It's that they watched what happened when people ignored their mental health and burned out for companies that didn't care about them. Speaking of mental health, let's address the elephant in the room. Millennials are often criticized for being too focused on therapy and talking about their feelings. But here's what's really happening psychologically. They're the first generation to grow up with widespread access to mental health resources and language. Previous generations dealt with anxiety and depression too, they just didn't have words for it or ways to address it. The problem isn't that millennials talk about mental health. The problem is when that talking becomes ruminating. Research shows that constantly discussing your problems without taking action can actually make anxiety and depression worse. But millennials who find the right balance between processing emotions and taking action often develop incredible emotional intelligence. Let's talk about their relationship with technology and attention spans. Millennials process information differently than both older and younger generations. They developed what researchers call continuous partial attention. They can work on multiple things at once, switching between tasks fluidly. But they also struggle with deep focus because their brains adapted to constant stimulation. Generation Z actually has shorter attention spans than millennials because they grew up with even more intense digital stimulation. But millennials remember what sustained focus felt like, so they often feel conflicted about their relationship with technology. They love the convenience and connection, but they also mourn the loss of deeper concentration. Here's something fascinating about millennial psychology that nobody talks about. They're incredibly collaborative, but also fiercely independent. They prefer team-based work environments where they can bounce ideas off colleagues, but they also want autonomy to execute those ideas their own way. This comes from growing up in group projects and team sports, but also navigating an economic landscape where you have to be your own advocate. Millennials are also the most educated generation in history, but many feel like that education didn't prepare them for the actual world they're living in. 75% of Generation Z thinks there are other ways to get a good education besides college, and they're learning from watching millennials struggle with student debt and underemployment. This created a unique psychological relationship with expertise and learning. Millennials respect knowledge and credentials, but they also value practical skills and real-world experience. They're constantly trying to bridge the gap between what they learned in school and what they need to know to thrive. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, millennial anxiety. Yes, they report higher levels of anxiety than previous generations. But here's what's really going on. They're living through more uncertainty and change than any generation before them. The rules of career success, relationships, and even basic life milestones keep shifting. Previous generations could follow a predictable path. Graduate, get a job, buy a house, get married, have kids, retire with a pension. Millennials are making it up as they go along because that path doesn't exist anymore. Of course they're anxious. They're pioneering a completely new way of being an adult. But here's what's remarkable about millennial psychology. Despite all this uncertainty and these challenges, they keep adapting. They're starting businesses, creating new industries, finding innovative ways to build community and meaning. They're not just surviving the changes they're living through, they're actively creating new solutions. Millennials have developed what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. They've been through enough economic and social upheaval that they've built psychological resilience muscles. They know how to pivot, how to reinvent themselves, how to find opportunity in chaos. They just wish they didn't have to be so good at it. So here's the truth about millennial psychology. They're not entitled or lazy or obsessed with avocado toast. They're a generation that learned to be psychologically flexible, emotionally intelligent, and constantly adaptive because the world demanded it of them. They're not complaining because they want sympathy. They're processing because that's how they figure out how to keep moving forward. The next time someone makes a joke about millennials, remember this. You're looking at a generation that's been beta testing the modern world for everyone else. Their psychology isn't broken, it's evolved. And the strategies they've developed for dealing with uncertainty, change, and complexity, the rest of us are probably going to need those skills too.